Welcome to your lecture on taking a position. This lesson is going to take us from our exploratory essays and reading our sources into actually creating our research papers. So stay tuned for some really important information coming up. So just a quick overview of what we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about what it means to take a position on something. So in your exploratory essays, you started off looking at both sides of an issue. You looked at a problem around your topic, and you just explored, right? That's why we call it an exploratory essay. So for this, we're going to turn your exploratory essay into your argumentative paper. You've read your sources. You're ready to take that next step and choose a side, essentially. We're going to talk about how to analyze an issue because, again, we don't just want to take sides based on our opinion of what we think the solution to the problem should be or why we think the problem is a problem. We want to really start to pick apart, right? That's what analyzing means, to pick apart. And we're also going to talk about sources and, finding sources, not just integrating them. So taking your position, again, you already have a topic that you've looked at both sides for. You should have a general understanding of that topic and what experts are saying about that topic from essay number 1. And that's why I start with that exploratory essay. I don't want you to go in thinking that there's only one side to a story or that the other side isn't valid. There's always a second side, and sometimes there's more than two sides, as I'm sure some of you found with your topics. But you're going to use the same topics. You don't have to reinvent the wheel. You're basically taking half of your exploratory essay and moving forward with that. You are going to mention the opposing side in the counter argument towards the end of your paper. It's only about a paragraph for this length of a paper that you have to address that other side. When you're reading articles, you'll see authors do this in different ways. Some of them bring up the other side right off the bat. Some of them bring it up right after the introduction. Some of them go back and forth. But for us, I want us to really work on presenting our argument, introducing the other side at the end, and then basically wrapping up and saying, I presented all this information that proves to be more valid or negates what this counter argument is saying. But your position needs to be valid. You can't just take a position based on an opinion. You have to have logic and reasoning and evidence, and that it's something that is believable. So, for example, I was working with a student this morning on the death penalty. You can take a position on either side of that. Either one of those is valid, but you have to have good reasons for that. I believe that it's wrong because, of a personal reason. That's not a valid position. So you want to make sure that as you're starting to take that side of your paper from your exploratory essay, turning it into argument, that the side you're taking is valid. So going from exploration to argumentation, which is argument writing. Again, you looked at two sides of the problem. You're just going to look at one side, but you're going to go more in depth this time. So with that side of your essay that you decide to choose, you're going to read two more sources. So at the end, you'll have, 3 or 4 sources even maybe from your side of the argument. You'll still have that one side of the counter argument. But remember, again, argument is not the same as opinion. An opinion is just a view or a judgment about something. It's not necessarily based on any kind of fact or knowledge. So, for example, an opinion would be, chocolate cake is the best kind. And this is a silly example. But that's not based in any kind of fact or knowledge. That's just based on my personal preference. An argument would be a reason or set of reasons, right? So if I was a restaurant owner, let's say, and I'm like, we're arguing over what kind of cake to put on the menu, I would need some kind of reasons to make a valid argument about why chocolate cake is the best kind and should be on there. And again, that's a silly example, but it helps to illustrate the difference between, I think versus there's an actual argument to be made here. But the aim of, we're still trying to persuade, right? Opinions aren't necessarily persuasive, it's just what you think. Whereas an argument is going to be constructed with the aim of persuading others that an action or idea is right or wrong. So again, some of you are working with ideas, some of you are working with actual actions. You're saying whether it's right or wrong. We're usually going to err on the side of right when we're doing an argument. So again, going back to that death penalty example, if you say, we should abolish the death penalty, why is that Why is that what we should do, right? It's always easier to argue from the what we should do rather than what we should not do, because that's what it's easier to find evidence for. And then you're also not in the negative the whole time. You're really identifying benefits rather than, why we shouldn't keep the death penalty is a weird way of saying that. We don't want to end up with any double negatives. So you may not be looking at something with benefits and detriments, but you want to make sure that you are trying to persuade people why that action or idea is right or wrong, depending on your topic. So sound arguments. So again, along the same lines of valid arguments, you need to make a sound argument. Your claim needs to be debatable. So saying something like, the sky is blue isn't debatable, right? That's a fact. Or if, again, we go back to that death penalty, like the death penalty exists in 28 states. That's a fact. That's not debatable, right? If we're looking at, why does the death penalty exist in those states, in 28 states, in the majority of states in the U.S., that would be something that might be debatable, right? So you can usually take something that's not debatable and make it debatable. I know I was working with another student on a topic about the effects of classical music on like stress, I think it was the student was working on. And there's not many people that are going to say classical music is bad for stress, but some people might say that it doesn't have any measurable benefits. So you want to think about that too. It's not always right and wrong. It might just be like, there's a good side of this and then it's neutral or it's not effective. So you don't always have to look for that bad side, but you have to write about something that's debatable. And then you have to be able to list reasons and support with evidence and address that opposing viewpoint. All of those put together are going to make your your sound argument for your research paper. Your reasons you're going to come up with on your own after doing all of your research. And then we'll talk about reasons versus evidence in the next slide. But you'll support your reasons that you come up with based on the evidence that you found. So the reasons should be yours, why you think this should or should not be accepted by the people you're trying to persuade. And then again, always addressing that opposing viewpoint. If you don't address the opposing viewpoint in your essay, it's not a sound argument because you're not acknowledging that there are other options here with your topic. And a lot of people are writing about controversial things for this paper because we like to explore those things. It doesn't have to be controversial. But I worked with a student last semester with something like zero waste, and her counter argument was really interesting because it was someone who was a proponent of saving the environment, but he believed more not in like individuals making changes, but in big corporations. Like I think the counter argument talked a lot about like concrete waste and construction waste, and like that's the problem, not how many straws we're using. So that was just another side, but it was still on the side of protecting the environment. So it doesn't have to be the total opposite of what you're saying either, your counter argument. So again, making your argument sound by acknowledging all of those different things is very, very important. So reasons versus evidence. So your reason is a rationale or explanation for a claim. So your claim is basically the argument that you're making in your thesis, and the reasons are those three divisions. Your evidence, on the other hand, is a specific instance of that rationale or that explanation. So a specific statistic or an example, those are evidence. That does not belong in your thesis statement. So example here, as you can see my little asterisk, I made this up just for argument's sake here. But so liberal arts is the best degree to earn. That's a claim, right? I'm making a claim because it teaches students independent thinking. That's my reason, right? Usually reasons will be followed by a word like because or as a result of or something like that. And then here I have my evidence. OCC liberal arts majors had stronger problem-solving skills than other majors, right? So I'm referring to a hypothetical study here. But that's what you want to do with your reasons versus evidence. So I just want you to understand the difference between those two, because a lot of times when we're starting and learning how to write, we put evidence in our thesis statement. We use statistics as reasons, and statistics are not reasons. Statistics are evidence. So I want you to be very careful about that when you're constructing your argument. Next thing you want to do is really think about your audience. So you're all scholars. I mention this all the time, that you want to think about your audience as an academic audience. So who's reading your paper? Other scholars, right? Your peers, your professors, other people who are in college. So you want to think about that when you're writing. And it's going to be different depending on the class, the assignment, but always keep your audience in mind. Think about what they believe. So if you're writing to an academic audience, what are some things that they believe? Obviously, they would believe that education is important, right? I had a student who wrote last semester about how vocational school was better than college. I said, but you're in college, you're a college student, and you're writing for a college audience. So what might be a problem here with this argument? We want to think about what common ground do we share. So again, as academics, as scholars, we all value certain things. We value knowledge, we value education, we value a certain tone in writing, which I'll talk about on the next slide. Think about also what you want your readers to believe. Do you want them to just take your argument at point blank, right? They're academics, so they're not going to just take your argument at face value. They might want to do their own research, or they might want to see what other people are saying about this issue. So think about what you really want your readers to believe at the end of your argument and throughout your paper. Also consider what they already know about the topic. So we call this the knowledge gap in academic writing, that we don't want to say things in our paper that our audience probably already knows, because that's insulting. I have students in a literature class who explain to me, what a symbol is. Like, I know what a symbol is. Your classmates know what a symbol is. Get to the point of what you're trying to tell me. Or they try to explain to me what an allusion is. Really consider what they already know, and remember that as you're writing. So if we're talking about the death penalty, most of your readers know what that is. You don't need to give a definition of what the death penalty is. But if it's something new, another student was working on assisted suicide or physician-assisted death, that's something that some of your readers may not be familiar with, and you might need to explain a little bit in your introduction. So really think about that. It's going to be different for everybody, so I don't give you a specific way to address this, but just think about what they already know. And then think about what they need to know. So if we're talking about capital punishment, we're figuring our readers already know what that is. What do they need to know in order to be persuaded in your argument? So if you're arguing against it, what's some information they need to know to believe that? And then think about why they should care. Everybody writes about all different kinds of topics, but you really want to consider that. You're not going to spell this out in your paper. You should care about this because. What you're going to do is consider that when you're using your tone, in the language that you're using, and really bring that home in the conclusion of your essay, why they should care about this. So if we're talking about zero waste, people should care about this because future generations aren't going to have a planet if we don't get our act together as humans. Climate change is real, despite what some people say, right? That's not debatable. The debate is, how do we address this? And there's all different ways to do that. But answering these questions as you're starting your paper are going to help you determine what information you need to make your essay very persuasive and very effective. Because I have students that have great topics and they just don't present a good argument for it because they haven't thought about these things. But when you think about these things, then you get that good argument and it's persuasive and it's effective. And I've had students change my mind about things or make me think about things that I haven't thought about before when they're writing. So really think about that. And again, I'm part of your audience. Your peers are part of your audience. So you want to start writing for that type of reader. Which brings us to argumentative tone and academic tone. So argumentative tone and academic tone are not the same. A formal academic tone is necessary, though, for a strong argument. If you come in using personal pronouns and sentence fragments and all this other nonsense, no one's going to take you seriously. And I'm going to talk about that when we talk about rhetorical strategies and rhetorical appeals with ethos. But you want to present yourself as someone who knows what you're talking about, right? So you want to avoid those personal pronouns. So first person pronouns are I, me, my, you. And then second person pronouns are you and your. You don't ever want to address your audience directly because you don't want to make any assumptions about that person. You also want to avoid contractions because that's more of like how we speak. We don't really use those in formal writing. So that's like when you use the apostrophe and don't or didn't, something like that. You would say do not, did not. Don't use slang or abbreviations. I think that kind of goes without saying, but your readers, English may not be their first language when you're writing. So you want to remember that they may not understand your slang or your colloquialisms or your abbreviations that you're using. So don't say things, for example, with rating cats and dogs, like someone whose language is not someone whose first language is not English may not understand what that means, right? So you want to write also in complex but coherent sentences. So complex doesn't mean long. It means that you're learning how to use conjunctions properly. It means that you're learning how to use semicolons and that you're presenting an idea and your sentences aren't choppy. Using appropriate evidence also helps argumentative tone. We don't use evidence, and we talked about this before, from blogs, from social media. We use academic sources and reliable sources. So make sure your evidence is reliable and appropriate to what you're saying. A lot of students will just pull quotes out of articles that have nothing to do with what they're talking about. Don't do that. Always make sure you're using evidence that's appropriate to your argument. And then present the information in a logical pattern. You can't just toss all your reasons into your thesis and assume that any which way you do that is going to make sense. You want to make sure that you're progressing in some kind of logical pattern, and that could be from least important to most important or vice versa. Some ideas might build on each other. So if you're talking about the death penalty, let's say some reasons are it doesn't deter crime, the laws are varying among states, and people are wrongfully accused. Those three things, we want to make sure we're presenting them in an order that makes sense for our reader. So we would say maybe, if I was writing the paper, I would say, the death penalty should be abolished because people are wrongfully accused, because, what was the other one I said? Oh my gosh, I just blanked. Anyway, I would present them in a way that makes sense to my reader. Sorry about that. So make sure you're presenting in a logical pattern. So when we're finding sources, again, we've talked about this, but remember we're going beyond just the Google. I don't want you to rely on Google anymore. Googling is good when we're looking for general information, but Google's not going to have all the information that we need. It's not always going to have academic sources. You can use Google Scholar, but again, it's a different algorithm than if you're using library databases. Your sources for your research paper must include the 2 from your exploratory essay, plus 2 academic journal articles, which I'm going to have another lecture on. You're going to find those in databases like Academic Search Premier, Project Muse. I'll show you what those are as well. You can also include 1 additional source if you would like. It's optional. You need 4. You can have 5. Try not to go beyond 5 because then the sources just end up being used once and taking over your paper. So your additional source can be anything you want. It can be another article. It can be from one of those generic databases. It can be a video. It can be a book. It can be whatever you want as long as it's reliable. And again, remember your sources should support and enhance your argument. If you remember that from our source integration video, they should not be holding up your argument, nor should they be irrelevant. All right, we've come to the end. I know this was a lot of information, but taking that exploration, that exploratory essay into argumentation, it's not that difficult if you follow all of these steps and address all of the questions that I've presented. You want to make sure that you're doing that. And again, you probably already had your position in mind when you chose that topic. So if you're writing about the death penalty, you probably already feel a certain way about that. Your sources may or may not have changed your mind about it. Probably not, because we're humans and we're stubborn. But again, that should be the easy part, is choosing the actual side. It's more than just that, though. Taking a position is more than just choosing a side. You want to make sure you have all of that. Make sure your sources are supporting your points, that you're addressing your audience. All the things I just talked about are going to go into that argument essay. So make sure that you save this, watch it as many times as you need to, and start thinking about what you need to do to take that exploratory essay into an argument essay. And I will see you in the next lesson.